Thank you, Tamar. Thank all of you for coming back or joining us for this third segment. These days are certainly been challenging and difficult for so many of us, and it's good to be able to take a breath and to talk again together about things that we have in common interests. With that, let's get started. This third segment, those of you who have been with us from the beginning will remember during the first discussion we talked about the formation of what became known as the Black-Jewish Alliance. We're talking about long-term processes of the two groups in the United States of Black people and Jewish people finding common ground in the long lead up to the early post-World War II years into the 1950s and the very, very beginnings of a public civil rights movement in the United States. That alliance that we talked about during that first segment had something to do with values, it had something to do with interests. We're talking about the 1940s and 50s when Jews and many non-Jews looking at Jews considered Jews to be a particularly vulnerable minority. Certainly in the world, and even in the United States, there was a history of discrimination at the social level, at the professional level, against Jewish people. And this idea that being discriminated against and being subjected to harassment or hate speech was something that created a common platform among similar victim groups, if we can refer to them that way. And that this coalition, if you will, was cobbled together at a particularly sensitive time. In Jewish history, it was just after the Holocaust, the idea that racism and race hatred could in fact, had in fact been deadly and could in fact continue to be or erupt again and become deadly once again was something that fueled, at least from the Jewish side, this idea that something that could be done together to make the United States safe for democracy, as it were. And these were ideas that were afloat. In addition, as we discussed, there was, at the level of social science or social analysis, there was the idea that actually people who hated other people because of who they were tended to hate across the board, that all hatred of a racial kind or based on who you were, who your parents were, what you looked like, and what you believed in, that all of those hatreds really were one and the same. And in order to battle one, you had to step up and battle all of them because they were all connected. In the second installment of this series, we saw that from the civil rights movement into the mid-1960s, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the battle against desegregation, particularly in the South, but not only, that this sort of high watermark, this getting into high gear, in which we saw major Jewish organizations and leading Jewish personalities linking arms both literally and figuratively with leaders from within the ranks of the Black civil rights groups, movements, and organizations. We also saw that the backlash, white supremacist backlash against the civil rights movement, particularly in the South, but also in some places in the Midwest, sometimes targeted synagogues, because in the popular discourse of the time, in the political discourse of the time, the idea of the Black-Jewish alliance was very much alive. And toward the end of the second segment last week, I began to point to those areas in which that alliance, towards the end of the 1960s, began to come apart at the seams, or at least some daylight was showing between the aims and agendas being pursued after 1964, after the Civil Rights Act became law, between activist Black figures and people in the Jewish community, either in organizations or individually. And that is where we're picking up the story today. And as Tamar mentioned, and as I hope you see on your screen, I've entitled this chapter, Black Power and Jewish Identity. And once again, the idea that one can look at some sort of pivot, some sort of turning point that led to a separation or weakening of the Black-Jewish alliance. This is something that is already in gestation by roughly 1968, 1969. I don't know how many of you will identify the pictures on the screen. Those of you of my generation probably do recognize Angela Davis as a young militant at the left, and on the right, one of the more and more frequent street demonstrations on behalf of Soviet Jewry that began to step up in frequency in the late 1960s and into the early 1970s. And we'll talk about that in a moment. The reason why I am pairing these two images is partly to set the agenda for this evening. And that is to say that different interests were at stake. Once we get beyond 1964, and certainly beyond 1968, different interests were being pursued by people who were the most interested in pursuing them in the streets, in demonstrations, in sit-ins, in creating a new kind of countercultural politics for the people of their own group. What were some of those agendas or aims that, we'll take a look first at the Black side of the issue, among the more militant wing of what morphed into the Black nationalist movement, Black Panthers, Black Power, and allied ideas. I'll try to boil it down into the most simple terms. If civil rights, and certainly desegregation, and the joining together of a wider coalition of people from different parts of American society, if that was based around one big idea that everyone had the right to be treated the same, that was the basis of that wide coalition in the 50s and into the early 60s. By the time we get to the late 60s, being treated the same is no longer at the top of the list. The top of the list is going to become the right to be different, the right to see oneself as different, and the right to make that difference into a platform of pride. One of the adjunct parts of that different approach was that to the extent that the United States was still a divided society along lines of confrontation between different origin groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, and so on, in the more militant wing of the post-civil rights Black organizations and Black movements among students and others, the idea was that in the United States, not all hatreds were the same. It wasn't true. they claimed, that the only real hatred, the only real division that counted in American history and in contemporary American society was the color bar, was the division between white and black, and was the enduring victimization of black people at the hands of white people. And that being the case, it wouldn't do to expand the idea of a brotherhood of fellow victim groups who were both black or white or Asian or what have you. Some of that idea that all of the different victim groups might actually come together, that was something that was in the offing, but much, much later, closer to our own day. And even now, it's said only within certain limits. But let's go back to the late 60s and understand that from the point of view of the more militant wing of black activism, the idea was that there were no natural allies for black people in the white community. And that was the focal point or the focus of the ideology that they were propounding. And that being the case, of course, it made it a little bit harder for sympathetic white people to get on that same bandwagon. So that certainly is something that needs to be taken into account, this shifting of the black agenda away from equality, integration, the right to be treated the same, over to the idea that we're not the same, we never were the same, we're never gonna be the same, and it's a good thing not to be the same. The other thing to take into account, of course, is that the interests between Jewish people and black people in America, which appeared to some extent to have some overlap in the years preceding the 1950s and the early 1960s, those interests continued to divide and separate as time went on. And I already mentioned last week that by the time we get to the 1950s, this post-war American Jewish generation had already reached middle-class status. The socioeconomic position of most Jewish people in the United States became better and better over time. Obviously, there were, and still are, pockets of Jewish poverty in the United States. But on average, and compared to most other population groups in the country, Jews were doing very well, thank you very much. And this was one of the key gaps that became more and more obvious between Jewish Americans and black Americans. This was going to be expressed even physically, geographically, spatially, as we go into the 50s and 60s, the trend among especially white Americans, including white ethnics, including Jews, to move out of the large cities towards the suburbs. And as Jews, among others, suburbanized, the inner cities were left more and more ghettoized. And once again, the availability of better quality of life and better housing stock, better municipal amenities, better school systems, all of these were pulling people with greater affluence out of the big cities towards the burgeoning suburbs during the 50s, on into the 60s, and into the 70s. Just to give you a quick statistic, New York City alone, which up until the mid-60s had a Jewish population of 2 million, by the time we get to the end of the 1960s, only 1 million Jews were left in the 5 boroughs of New York City. The other million had moved outside the city limits and were to be found in the tri-state area. So, you know, these are built-in very important social differences that could account for the fact that Well, we had a particular interest in common with those of a weaker position, but once that interest was achieved successfully through civil rights legislation, through pushing test cases through the courts, through ensuring equal access to voting rights, equal protection under the law, once you got all of that in place, and anti-discrimination legislation affecting employment in public services, once you had all of that in place, what interest did Jewish people feel when it came to the further pursuit of newer agendas as they were arising? And as I mentioned last time, some of the newer agendas had to do more with social equality as an unattained goal, and less to do with legal desegregation or integration, if you will. One of the after effects of the ghettoization taking place in America's inner cities was the frequency of street violence and crime that began to become a major national concern right after the, right from the summer of '64 through the summer of '68 and beyond. In many cases, poorer white people who were still living in the inner city, who were still sometimes lower middle class, small business owners, or who may have owned property in areas that were becoming slums, and indeed some of them were slumlords. Not a pretty word, but there were some like that. To the extent that Jewish people had once lived in those neighborhoods and were still there, either they or their property were still there, they were among those who felt victimized by the street violence and violent crime that began to burgeon in America's large cities, particularly after the middle of the decade, the middle of the 1960s and beyond. So what were the interests or the agendas that Jewish people were starting to think about and even pursue that pulled them away from the older Black Jewish Alliance? We noticed how in the militant wing of the Black movement there were people finding new values and new ideas to push for, to fight for, to stress Black pride, to stress the empowerment of Black people to fight back. And that was pulling them away from the idea that, well, Black people and white people could easily cooperate if they had the same values. But on the Jewish side, what's the Jewish side of the coin? And here I'd like to return us to this shift that I mentioned briefly last week between a Cold War 1950s style discourse about the three major religions of America, or the Judeo-Christian ethic. This was a very popular idea in the 1950s, partly because many of the social strains, if you will, or tensions or frictions between different groups were still along religious lines in the 1940s and 50s, but also because during the Cold War, from the White House on down, the idea was being stressed that all Americans shared some fundamental values in common having to do with democracy, a belief in some form of divine providence, a certain moral code that went together with democracy, so it was believed, rooted in religious ideals, rooted in the Ten Commandments, and that how one prayed and to which God one prayed was less important in the long run than the underlying sameness, the similarity that was alleged to exist between Americans of different faiths. One of the symbolic publications of that era of the 1950s was the book by Will Herberg, Protestant Catholic Jew. Interestingly enough, in that book he actually criticized this idea that all religions were really the same underneath. Nevertheless, the idea of the book and the title of the book, and it was a very popular read, Protestant Catholic Jew, encapsulated this idea that where America was going was a kind of a triple melting pot, that all of the Ellis Island ethnics who were Catholic were all merging together. All of the American Protestants, at least the white ones, were merging together. All of the old separations were falling by the wayside. The Jews of different backgrounds, whether they were from German-speaking heritage or East European Jewish heritage, they were all merging together too. And this triple melting pot was making America more livable, more tolerant, and everybody believed the same things anyway, so what difference did it make? If that sort of script was viable or could play during the 1950s, and if Dwight Eisenhower, when he was president, came out at some point and said, well, it doesn't matter what you believe, as long as you believe, because there was this idea that, well, Americans are believers in all of the right and moral things, and the Soviets were godless communists, and the Cold War was about this clash of civilizations. In the 60s, there's a drawing away from this idea of a triple melting pot, from this idea that religions were drawing people together as Americans into one sort of common pool of religious values. We're moving away from that, and if the book by Will Herberg in the 1950s symbolized the old idea of the Judeo-Christian ethic or the triple melting pot, by the time we get to 1961, there's a new book out called Beyond the Melting Pot, co-authored by Nathan Glazer and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And Beyond the Melting Pot, which, as you see, was subtitled The Negroes, Puerto Ricans, Jews, Italians, and Irish of New York City, was all about getting down to specifics about heritage groups, ethnicity, different cultures, and how the melting pot may never actually have happened, that America was already beyond the melting pot, and maybe it wasn't a bad thing for people to celebrate their different heritage. So this idea that not everybody needs to be the same in order to be treated equal, that people actually have the right to be different under the aegis of some liberal idea of American democracy. This was something that some Jewish people were also beginning to identify with. The old, all of the religions together, everyone believes the same thing, everyone is equally American, equally patriotic. It had its other iconic form in the story of the four chaplains. And some of you may remember the tragic sinking of the USS Dorchester during World War II by German U-boats off the coast of Newfoundland. And it was a troop ship, the USS Dorchester. During the sinking of that ship, four Army chaplains who were aboard with the men chose to remain on the ship, gave their life jackets away to other soldiers so that they could possibly save themselves, and they went down with the ship, and they became known collectively as the Four Chaplains. And there were two Protestant ministers, one Catholic priest, and one rabbi. And this idea that this act of bravery and sacrifice in the name of American patriotism during wartime. This indeed was and as you see on the stamp that was issued in their honor, somewhat later, was given the subtitle Interfaith in Action. That is to say that actually Americans can get together despite their differences of belief. And again, just to stress the idea that these ideas were very, very strong in the 1950s. Another example would be the building of the 3 chapels at what was then Idlewild Airport in New York City, later, of course, renamed JFK Airport. The 3 chapels representing the 3 major religions of the United States, a synagogue, a Catholic chapel, and a Protestant chapel, church and a Protestant chapel. You'll notice that they are of equal size, they are spaced equidistant apart, and they are spaced so that at no point during the day will the shadow of one fall on the other one, the next door neighbor. This idea that there were 3 major religious groups in America was a bit of a con job on the part of Jewish publicists and others. Because after all, Judaism is not a major religion percentage-wise compared to Protestantism and Catholicism. At their height, American Jews represented no more than 3% of the American population. And since then, it's gone down to 2% and dipped a bit below. So the idea that one could promote Judaism as the 3rd major religion of American society was a public relations feat that worked out pretty well in the 1950s and on into the 1960s. I'll remind you that the 60s was not just the decade of civil rights, it was the decade of Vatican II. It was the decade of ecumenism and the rapprochement between the Catholic Church and other Christian churches, and between Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. The Jewish people were exonerated, as it were, from the accusation of deicide. People were talking about interfaith in much more realistic and positive terms than had been the case before World War II. So well did this succeed that by the time we get into the 1960s, with a younger generation coming up, being influenced by, exposed to and influenced by the counterculture, the idea that you don't have to wait for major organizations to push your agendas, you should make your own agenda, you have your own right to be different and to express that difference, and to openly take it to the streets, take it to the public square, that the integration that had been the pipe dream of the generations before had been so well achieved that the new concern among many Jewish people, including many young people, was assimilation. Integration had worked so well that the idea now began to float around that actually the future of Jewishness in American society was not something to be taken for granted. That despite the nice model of the 3 religions, ensuring Jewish continuity over the next generations was going to take a good deal of innovative work. And so we begin to morph by the late 60s from a world of let's treat everyone the same because we're all the same underneath anyway, to a world of roots. And the 2, blockbuster books of that era, I'm quite sure that you remember at least one of them, if not both. The book Roots by Alex Haley, which of course was then later televised as a fantastically popular miniseries. People sat glued to their TV sets and watched Roots for hours. And it became a metaphor for this rediscovery of the importance of heritage, difference, the positive pride of being different. And there may be several equivalents on the Jewish side. I chose to showcase the book World of Our Fathers by Irving Howe. The late Irving Howe was an important literary critic and intellectual figure from the liberal left or the democratic socialist left. Howe rediscovered the importance and indeed vitality of the world of his parents. And in other words, the idea that the immigrant generation, which back in the day, their kids were just trying to get rid of their foreign accents, trying to be as American as possible, trying to win a place in American society and integrate themselves to push beyond the hurdles of discrimination that were still barring the paths that were not always open to them. This idea of rediscovering the world of our fathers by the 1960s and early 70s was becoming far more important than building on the successes of Jewish integration. Jewish integration was seen as a terrific success story, but perhaps even too successful. And the idea was one must now roll back some of that in order to assure the continuity between one Jewish generation and the next. Indeed, the counterculture of American fame showed up on Jewish bookshelves with the publication of the Jewish catalogs, the first, then the second, and then there was a third. The idea of the Jewish catalog obviously is an homage or a Jewish take on the famous Whole Earth catalog, which was an iconic book about the way in which one could restructure the world from the bottom up. The Jewish catalog indeed was just the same, only how do you restructure Jewish life from the bottom up? Not waiting to hear sermons from a pulpit up above, not waiting to hear the latest communique or press release from an organization up above, but do your own thing, do your own Jewish thing, bake your own challah, create your own chavurah instead of going to an institutional synagogue with four walls. The Jewish catalog was the Jewish counterculture answer to the idea of a new identity. Excuse me. And finally, taking Jewishness to the streets seriously from the grassroots, and here I come back to this idea that the struggle for the rights of the Jews in the Soviet Union, not only to be able to freely express themselves in their culture and their identity, but also to emigrate. The students that you see in this picture holding the protest signs, they come from an organization called SSSJ, the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, as you'll see the triple SJ inked on the placards that they're carrying. Excuse me. The idea that the triple SJ and other more, I'll call them radical groups, mainly of younger people who began to take to the streets starting after 1966 and with greater verve and frequency after 1967, 68, 69, these people were not demonstrating for the rights of fellow Americans on any issue. They were demonstrating for the right of their fellow Jews across the globe, particularly those who were being politically oppressed, their rights trampled upon, and indeed the call to let my people go, very timely now that we're nearing Pesach. Let my people go became the slogan that most typified those late 60s, the era of the Soviet Jewry campaign. Interestingly enough, there's one other connection between the Soviet Jewry campaigns and the previous history of the civil rights movement in the United States, and this is something that is not very well known. During the early to mid-1960s, Israel kept trying to introduce resolutions in the United Nations to protest and condemn and to call upon the Soviet Union to respect its own laws and to grant its Jewish citizens equality in terms of cultural rights, cultural self-expression, the right to access to religious institutions and so forth. And time and again, when Israeli representatives tried to push the idea of such a resolution through the corridors at the United Nations, they hit a brick wall, namely as follows. The Soviets would come back and say, well, if you want to push an anti-discrimination resolution through the General Assembly or in other UN institutions, we're going to push a similar anti-discrimination and anti-racism resolution through targeting the United States, on the basis, of course, that the United States was a racially divided society, and up until 1964 it was legal to discriminate racially in many parts of the United States. And this roadblock was something that the United States was not willing to deal with. The United States that might otherwise have very gladly supported a resolution that targeted the Soviet Union for its denial of religious freedom, cultural freedoms, and other such human rights, the United States got cold feet when it came to actually pushing it through, simply because of the vulnerability of the United States on the grounds of its own very questionable situation in terms of equality. Going through the end of the 60s into the 1970s, the new political and social agendas that began to affect the entire discourse around what could be achieved beyond legal equality. I mentioned last time this idea of affirmative action, which is reverse discrimination, the idea that one could countenance the idea of looking at who somebody was, what part of society did they come from, in order to give those who had been at a disadvantage earlier due to discrimination, to give them added opportunities to begin to create a more equal playing field. Affirmative action became an explosive and divisive issue between former allies of the civil rights movement and the black movement in the Jewish community. There were some groups that continued to say, yes, America's racial history necessitates some kind of compensatory policy at the level of higher education, at the level of employment, what have you, that affirmative action or reverse discrimination as an idea was actually a positive thing to do. Nonetheless, most of those same organizations were saying, we won't be able to support this idea once you get to actually enumerating quotas of how many people of one color, how many people of another color, how many people of one particular heritage group, and so forth. Quotas was not something that the Jewish community was willing to swallow, if only because quotas had been used so extensively against Jewish people in the United States in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. On the other hand, and here's an interesting twist, it's the same decade and a half that saw the flowering of feminism, and the fight for women's equality also involved affirmative action. The idea that women ought to be promoted more effectively through the opportunity system, as it were, in order to compensate for the way that women were disproportionately discriminated against before and even in contemporary society. Interestingly enough, although the majority establishment part of the Jewish community voiced reservations against affirmative action, actually the Jewish community reaped a tremendous benefit from some parts of affirmative action, namely by the rapid rise through the ranks, not only in the academic world, but also in the corporate world and in business, of Jewish women, who no less than Jewish men tended to be high achievers, but they were underrepresented in the top ranks of various spheres of life. And actually, this benefit of affirmative action tended also to benefit Jews in the United States. Another offshoot that was an interesting benefit was that talking about all of this, of the importance not only of equality, but of the importance of pride in being different, was a trend that entered the academy very quickly in the form of ethnic studies, gender studies, African American studies, and Jewish studies. In other words, the entire enterprise of academic Jewish studies, which had been a fledgling enterprise up until 1960, by the early 70s, it was coming into its own, so that any American college and university worthy of its name was looking for ways to incorporate Jewish studies into its curriculum, and a whole new cadre of Jewish academic professionals was trained and groomed in order to create a space for Jewish culture and Jewish heritage within the American Academy. It is perhaps a sad comment that in the moment that we're speaking today, some of that is under fire, and that the idea that Jews and their heritage and identity and values could become part of a wider, more diverse academic discourse in the United States is under fire today under the circumstances with which we are all familiar. Just to quickly round things up and tie up some loose ends, what was left of the vaunted Black-Jewish alliance after all of this separating out of the strands of different interests, different agendas, separating according to, I'm proud of that, but you're proud of that? Interestingly enough, the Jewish voting trend, certainly in presidential elections, remained disproportionately similar to trends among black voters in the United States. That is, if you compare Jews with other white voters in the United States, you'll find that the Jewish vote was much, much closer, and indeed sometimes even identical to the voting trends among African Americans. That idea that Jews still continue to vote according to the values of the older 1950s, 1960s era alliance in favor of liberal values, liberal legislation, equality under the law, and so forth, that has not changed very much over the years, and it's been fairly stable. And I will leave you with, this idea that some sort of basis of overlapping interests and overlapping values actually still exists and could be perhaps resurrected or strengthened or encouraged. Here's a pie chart showing the voting for Barack Obama when he was running for president versus Republican candidates among Jewish voters. This is a pie chart of the American Jewish electorate. And as you'll see, even though 62% is not as high as 70 or 80%, nevertheless, it's quite high compared to what other white Americans were putting into their, putting on their ballots. And finally, one of the important political duos that emerged subsequently because of this Democratic Party alliance that remained up until very recently. And once again, Barack Obama with his friend Rahm Emanuel, only it's a reversal of fortune, because rather than Jews being the patrons and helping to guide people who are active in political life and public life from within the African American community, here it's the reverse. The patron is the first African American US president, and his sidekick and aide is a Jewish American with Israeli roots. And the idea that some sort of coming together of the minds and the values and of interests was still on the cards is something that may be encapsulated in this picture. Of course, nothing stays the same. Everything is dynamic, and I'm not sure that right now in 2024 we're in the same place where we were in 2012. On that note, let me leave a little bit of time for those of you who may have sent in some questions and looking for a bit of discussion. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Eli, and thank you for these lectures, which I think give us the historical background to understand some of the processes that are happening these days with American Jewry. So our first question is it true that ethnic studies for others was aimed at establishing community, while this was not the case with Jewish studies?
I'm not sure I could agree with that suggestion. Jewish studies obviously had a long intellectual history in Europe in particular that could be transplanted to the United States, and it was transplanted to the United States during the era of mass Jewish immigration. But where did it land? It was transplanted, but where did it land? It landed at the rabbinical seminaries. It landed at Hebrew Union College. It landed at the Jewish Theological Seminary. It landed at Yeshiva University. It ended up finding a bit of a home at the first secular Jewish-sponsored American university, Brandeis, that wasn't founded until after the Second World War. But it didn't really find a place in the American university system at large. You had, at best, places like Harvard, which taught Hebrew, but there were no courses in Jewish history and Jewish culture, certainly nothing modern or contemporary. And the idea that one could expand on that, expand on those very, very small beginnings, and bring Jewish studies to the campus, it was very much directed at building community, in particular because it was aimed at a younger generation which was said to be suffering from a deficit of Jewish knowledge. And if you couldn't get them in Hebrew school, now you had a second chance. They were flooding to the university campuses. Over 90% of American Jewish youth attended college of one kind or another. Here was a second opportunity to bring quality, in-depth Jewish learning to a population that didn't even know it was missing it. And it was very much a part of the agenda of academic Jewish studies to do that.
Could you explain how is it that African Americans today are identifying with the Palestinians?
That's a big question. Let me sort of go back. In fact, we can perhaps visually go. I don't know. Is this still up on the screen, Tamar? Okay. So let's go back to the era of Black power and Black nationalism. Once the ideology was in place that said that the only oppressor-victim relationship that mattered was between white people and black people, by 1967, 68, 69, after Israel's war in 1967, Israel occupied the territories, the West Bank, the Golan, and the Sinai, very, very quickly, immediately, in 1968 already. The Black Panthers and other militant black groups were making an equivalency between Israelis, whom they imagined to be white oppressors, and Palestinians, whom they imagined to be darker-skinned victims, just like they were. In other words, projecting the whole American situation that they experienced and projecting it on the entire world, the entire post-colonial world. Never mind that not every place is the United States. Never mind that not everyone with a darker skin is a victim. That didn't enter into the equation. Everything was boiled down to very, very simplified formulas. And in that sense, already by 68, 69, we have this idea that if you feel strongly against racism in America, then you also have to feel strongly about racism elsewhere. And they interpreted the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as yet another example of white settler colonialism and racism directed against darker-skinned people. And nothing really has changed much in the ideology. What has changed is that it's become far more popularized and, if you will, even dumbed down to a certain extent over the years since 68. Even though a lot of time has passed, generations have come and gone, but the idea that was propagated in 68, 69 is still the same idea that's being propagated in some parts of the black communities today.
Okay, and I think our last question for this evening is regarding the fact that Jews in Europe were sometimes referred to as the Jewish race. Were American Jews considered a race? Were they considered passing for white?
Another excellent question. I'll try to do justice to it in just a couple of minutes. Back in the day, we're talking back at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the English word race was used more or less in an equivalent way to what today we would call ethnic groups, ethnicity, or even national groups. Race was very, very commonly equated with other forms of national origins. And it was indeed sometimes used by Jews too. Jews used words the way their neighbors used them. And it wasn't felt to be anything necessarily bad to have pride in one's race. And we're talking about 1910s, 1920s. Pride of race was something that was still, in those days, in the parlance of that time, considered to be pretty okay. Once we get beyond the 1920s, race ideology, as it was deployed by Nazism and fascism, became the most dangerous thing to Jewish life, and in fact was responsible for wiping out, as we know, a third of the Jewish people. Once that happened, Jews quickly abandoned any possible affinity that they might have had for using the word race in connection to themselves. It was simply not done anymore. And they chose peoplehood as a better word, or they spoke either of the Jewish people or they spoke of Jewish culture. They did not speak about Jewish race anymore. Now, where does this get more and more complicated? Well, if you're not a race, and if you're a people or a culture, then where do you fit in American terms? Well, you know, Jews weren't invented for American terms. Jews were invented in the Middle East 3,000 years ago. And the categories that govern who the Jews are and what the Jews are really don't fit the United States as categories. And nevertheless, if you're living in the United States and you're dealing with the parlance that goes in American society, then in the end, of course, Jews are going to be considered, by and large, white by American racial categories. Not all Jews are white, we knew this. But even so, the great majority of Jews in the United States are considered white at a social level. They were considered white enough to be able to be freely admitted as immigrants from Europe at a time when Chinese immigrants were being excluded, African immigrants, of course, were not even admitted, and so forth. So being white to that extent was a certain advantage in American society, not to say that it solved all of the Jews' problems. It didn't, because as we know, American society knows very, very well, it knew back then, and to some extent it still does, it knows very well how to separate out the people that we like from the people that we don't like. And being white wasn't necessarily the ultimate test. It became a white and black issue more when, as we saw this evening, when black people themselves decided to take on this idea that only the white and black issue mattered. All other conflicts, all other dissensions, all other frictions, religious, ethnic, or otherwise, we're not even in the same league and shouldn't be treated in the same league. And in that sense, this idea that one could make common cause with all sorts of diverse groups, I think that idea suffered in consequence.
Thank you very much, Eli. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Wish you all a good Pesach. We'll be back after Pesach with our next series with Dr. Catherine Aaron Beller about the Jews of Greece. So be well, and thank you.